How's that? Better. All right. Well, good morning. We have lots of visitors here. Appreciate y'all being here. We're going to dig right into Acts, the 25th chapter. Before we begin, I've asked one of the visitors, Brother Adam Olson, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Oh God, we come before you this morning grateful people to assemble together in your name. And we are grateful to have fellowship in our Lord Jesus Christ, and we are grateful for the scriptures which you have so graciously blessed us with. We pray for wisdom and insight today as we study it, that you will open our hearts and open our minds, that we may know more about you and draw closer to one another as a result of it. May our lights shine brightly this day. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. All right, so we've been working through the book of Acts for several months now. We're kind of on the downhill swoop of this. As some of you know, Brother Stephen tested positive for COVID Friday night, and so I'm swapping for him this week, and he's taken the next 2 weeks, and then we will really be closing out our study 3 weeks from now, December 31st. So it's been a good study. I've enjoyed it greatly. I know he wishes he could be here this morning. If you're there on live stream, Stephen, good morning. Hope you're feeling better. All right. And I have to say, I really appreciate Stephen providing his notes. That would have been a little quick turnaround, so he provided his notes for me this morning. It's going to be very, very helpful. Well, it's always, as we typically do, we'll start with our memory verse from Hebrews, the 3rd chapter for December, Hebrews 3:14. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. All right, we've been using this ABC tool to help us remember the chapter headings and kind of things that happen in the book. If you'll notice, there are a couple missing up there. If anybody can tell me from chapter 12 what the L stands for.
Loss.
Good try. You can always count on Ben to at least give me an answer. May not be the right one. Yeah, I know you do. It does start with an L.
Liberated.
Thank you. Liberated again. And so if we think about that, liberated again, who was liberated again in chapter 12? Peter, that's right. And why does it say he was liberated again? So what chapter does that make you think of from the first time? Chapter 5, yeah, thank you. So the empty jail, remember that occurrence, all right? And so chapter 12, liberated again, brings us to chapter 18, R. Anybody remember? So chapter 17, questions answered at Athens. So we know he went from Athens, he went to Corinth after that. And then the story in chapter 18, reasoning with the preacher, wasn't with Paul. Who was reasoning with the preacher?
Priscilla.
Thank you, Priscilla and Aquila, that's correct. And what preacher were they reasoning with? Apollos. Thank you, David. Yes, very good. And then really kind of what started everything off that we're dealing with now with Paul in Caesarea is chapter 21, where things really start. It's the end of his third missionary journey. And what does the U stand for? There is an uproar. There's an uproar in Jerusalem, exactly right. And this uproar in Jerusalem that started with the false accusations by the Jews that Paul had taken Trophimus, this Ephesian, into the temple, really started everything that is now transpiring as we're kind of closing out the end of this series here. So last week we left off with Paul having spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea. If you take a look at the end of chapter 24, verse 27, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So we find here the map here where we're still in Caesarea, where Paul's been in prison for the last couple of years, and everything is he's had 2 years where he's just been, we don't know exactly what he's been doing, where his companions have been, what they have been doing, but we know he's been 2 years in Caesarea. The city above there, I think, is really interesting. Ptolemais he landed, when he initially came to Jerusalem, he landed in Ptolemais, then sailed to Caesarea, just up the coast. Ptolemais was a Phoenician city, and actually was really, really important at the time. That's where ultimately when the Roman Empire came and conquered the Jewish in the Jewish-Roman War in 66 through 70 A.D., that's where the Romans landed. That's where they started their battles from. And then in the medieval times, that's where the Crusades, where the Crusaders started from. They called that city Acre. You may have heard that term before. So it's actually the modern city of Acre or Akko. But that whole coastline is really, really important to the Romans and to the Jews. And so we find Paul here in Caesarea, where he had been, as I mentioned, for the last couple of years. How would you describe? We talked last week about the political climate that was kind of surrounding the whole events there in Caesarea with Felix. How would you describe the political climate at the time that we're talking about here between the Jews and the Romans? What was happening? It was not silent at that time. Distrust, right? So Felix was acting out against the Jews. He was taking bribes. He was treating them poorly. He was trying to curry favor with the Jews, but treating them poor at the same time. He had his masters in Rome that he was trying to please. So things were generally getting rather heated. This is the period of time right before the Jewish War began in AD 66, and the tensions were really getting hot between the Jews and the Romans. Paul ultimately knew that he was going to wind up in Rome because the Lord had told him that he would wind up in Rome. But even knowing this, if you think about this, the Lord came to Paul and said, "You're going to testify for me," in the end of chapter 23, he said, "You're going to testify for me in Rome." But it took over 2 years for that to happen. And you think about that kind of retrospectively, we know what the end of the story is, right? We know that he gets to Rome. But for Paul in prison, he's got to trust in the Lord. He's got to have faith that's going to happen, that ultimately he is going to get to his destination, which was promised to him, that he's going to testify there, but he's also going to testify for Jesus about the things that he had endured, and his witness, his testimony, that was going to happen in Rome. And he had to trust in God that was going to happen. How does that impact us when we think about what our ultimate destination is? Do things necessarily happen the way we want it to happen? But can we have faith and trust in the Lord that ultimately that is going to be our destination, that we are going to reach our heavenly destination? Paul had to endure something similar while here on earth, waiting for the right timing. So we get to chapter 25, and we meet this new guy, Festus. If the old people in this room, when you hear the word Festus, what do you think about? You got to think about Gunsmoke, right? The very first thing, old cowboy hat, and you ever? Yeah, I thought that was good. Gunsmoke. Look it up. It'll probably be on YouTube or Google or something like that. So that's not the Festus we're talking about. Porcius Festus. And as the text states there in chapter 20, into chapter 24, he was the successor of Felix as the procurator or governor of Judea. And we only read about him in the Bible here in Acts chapter 24 through Acts chapter 26. If you read historians, Josephus, the writer, actually had some really favorable things to say about Porcius Festus. He recorded that at the time Festus took power, there was a lot of unrest, which we'd mentioned. There were bandits called Sicarii that were roaming the countryside, and they were pillaging and stealing and burning villages. And Festus was actually able to corner the Sicarii out in the wilderness. His forces were able to wipe them out. He provided some good things for the people of Judea. And it's interesting enough, Paul's case was not the only time that Festus allowed Jews to appeal to Caesar. There's another case where King Agrippa II, which we'll meet here in just a little bit, but King Agrippa II had built a dining area in his palace there in Jerusalem. And because of the elevation of the palace, this new dining area looked down into the temple. And do you think the Jews enjoyed him eating his meals and kind of looking down from his... No, they didn't. So what did they do? They built a wall higher and higher and higher so that King Agrippa couldn't look down into the temple. So what did King Agrippa want to do? King Agrippa wanted to tear down the wall. So there was this big fight over a wall that was built because of King Agrippa's building plans there. So ultimately, Festus told the Jews to tear it down. The Jews appealed to Nero, appealed to Caesar, and Festus allowed them to appeal to Caesar. Nero rules in the Jews' favor, believe it or not. So this is very early in Nero's reign. So he rules in their favor. The Jews come back, and they actually are able to tear that wall down. So Festus only stays on the scene for another 2 or 3 years before he dies, but not a lot is written about him or said about him, but an interesting character nonetheless. So that's Festus. He is now in charge, and let's begin our reading here in Acts chapter 25. Let's read the first 5 verses. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. And they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority come among you, go down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. So just for a second, let's just go back real quick. So Festus lands in Caesarea. He's only there for about 3 days. He goes up to Jerusalem. While he's there, the Jews bring these charges and talk to him about Paul. And they said, hey, bring Paul up to Jerusalem so that they can kill him. Instead, Festus says, well, no, why don't you guys, I gotta go back to the city anyway. I've only been here 3 days. I need to get back. And essentially he says, no, why don't you come down to me? So our first question for the book, if you're following along, is what favor did the high priests and chief men of the Jews ask of Festus while he was in Jerusalem? And what was their purpose in asking this favor? Really, as we just mentioned, the Jews asked Festus to summon Paul from Caesarea to Jerusalem. They were going to ambush him. They were going to kill him again. Have we heard this story before? Yeah, they keep trying to kill Paul. They want to silence Paul. They want to kill him. They're not good with just him stopping preaching. They want to absolutely kill him and end his life. So really, kind of unwittingly, Festus spoils the Jews' plot. The Jews were asking Festus really to facilitate this murder. Festus didn't grant their request, but told them to go with him to Caesarea, and they were going to accuse Paul of his crimes while in Caesarea. Questions about that? It's fairly self-explanatory. Let's continue our reading in verse 6 of chapter 25. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took a seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Your Bible, go back to look at verse 6. Does anybody have a different word where it says he took his seat on the tribunal?
Judgment seat.
Judgment seat. Okay, judgment seat, tribunal. It's the same word in Greek. I'm not a Greek scholar, but the word there is bema. So, and you think about this, is there any sense of deja vu here? Paul's defended himself in Jerusalem before the mob, during the uproar in Jerusalem. He's defended himself before the Sanhedrin the next day. He's defended himself before Felix. He's reasoned with Felix a number of times over the last 2 years that he's been in prison. Now the Jews show up again with the new governor Festus, and this time Luke keeps the account really, really short. Very, very short. Festus comes and he sits on the tribunal or the judgment seat. So in the Bible, tribunal or judgment seat translates the Greek word bema, B-E-M-A. And it occurs 12 times in the New Testament, and it's really a raised. This is a good slide that Stephen supplied me. This is the judgment seat. This is a amphitheater in Athens, the temple of Dionysius. And this was the judgment seat or the dais from which the judge or the officiator would stand or sit. And so it's this raised platform where the judge or the leader addressed an assembly. And so in the New Testament, we read about the judgment seat of Pilate in Matthew the 27th chapter and in John 13. We read about Herod in chapter 12 when Herod Agrippa the First was in the picture here. He actually sits on a judgment seat. Gallio in Acts 18 is referred to as sitting on a judgment seat, and Festus now in Acts 25. So these officials would hear the judgments, and they would judge on important matters from the bema, from the judgment seat. So this bema is this place where a person of authority, it dispenses judgments, but they also would reward someone or dispense with rewards. Twice in the New Testament, bema is used really with a theological context in terms of a future judgment of Christ. If you take a look at Romans the 10th chapter, Romans the 14th chapter. In Romans 14, beginning in verse 10, "Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God." Here it's used in terms of a reference of a future judgment in front of Jesus Christ. And if you turn over a few pages to 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in verse 9, "So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." So this idea of the judgment seat would be very clear to them, the people at this time, and in this context of these, again, that judgment seat is in front of Jesus Christ. So back to chapter 25 of Acts, we find ourselves with Paul. Again, this defense is very, very short. Very, very short. It's almost like a snippet that the author Luke is stuck into the context here. But there's really a threefold series of charges that Paul says he's innocent of. If you take a look at verse 8 of chapter 25, really he says, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." No civil penalty. I haven't committed a civil crime. I haven't committed a religious crime. I haven't committed a criminal crime against anybody. And the Jews, they still can't prove anything. The Jews, time and time again, they've come up or come down, Jerusalem to Caesarea. They can't prove anything. And it's been very, very obvious this whole time. So maybe over those 8 to 10 days that Paul records for us in chapter 25, maybe over those 10 days that he remained in Jerusalem before heading back down to Caesarea, maybe that was a time where the Jews had been able to kind of influence and curry favor with Festus, just like they tried to do with his predecessor Felix. But Festus is trying to make a good first impression. He's new on the scene. He's a new governor. He's got some pretty cantankerous subjects that he's having to rule and govern over. So he's trying to make a good first impression with those people of his province that he's trying to rule for the Romans. And he's likely wanting to understand the needs that his people have, the needs of the people, learn more about the Jews. Take a look at the statement here in chapter 25. I do think it's rather interesting. It's a side note. This is obviously not the main point of the discussion here, but look at verse 11. "If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them." Do you find it interesting that here, what is Paul's argument? Is Paul's argument here that there's something sinful about capital punishment? What's his argument?
Well, if he's done something wrong, then I'm worthy of death.
And he says that's sinful? He says he would accept that if he was guilty of that. So his argument is not against capital punishment. His argument is the fact that I haven't done anything deserving of death. But if I had, I would accept it. Kevin, you have something?
Yeah, just in conjunction with that, we see Paul putting himself under the authority of the civil government. We don't see him causing insurrection. He obeyed the laws of the land, was willing to accept the punishment, like you just said in that particular verse.
Yeah.
And it's right to seek support, like Paul did from the civil government as well, in in certain situations.
He's done it a number of times. He's used his Roman citizenship to keep himself from being flogged and being tortured. He's appealed using the laws of the land. He said in his defense with Felix that I've not committed any of these things. I wasn't in the temple causing up trouble. I wasn't in the synagogue causing up trouble. I wasn't in the city causing and stirring up trouble. And again, they can't prove that I was. So here he is. It's interesting that he mentions this. He wasn't guilty of a crime worthy of punishment. It does, in the Old Testament, though, if you think about this idea of capital punishment, again, just as an aside, murder's wrong. Murder is wrong. It's wrong in the Old Testament. What was to happen to murderers in the Old Testament? They were executed. They were executed. They had forfeited their right to live. Number of times, obviously, in the Old Testament. Exodus 20, 10 Commandments, you shall not murder. Exodus 21, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. And Deuteronomy 19, but if anyone hates his neighbor and lies in wait for him, rises against him and strikes him mortally so that he dies and he flees to one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and bring him from there and deliver him over to the hand of the avenger of blood that he may die. Your eye shall not pity him, but you shall put away the guilt of the innocent blood from Israel, that it may go well with you. Even if a murderer were to flee, what did they call those cities? The cities of refuge. Even if he fled to the city of refuge, they were commanded, if that was premeditated, to pull him away from there and execute him. In order for things were going to go poorly for the country. In order to cleanse that sin, that blood, take that blood away, in order for things to go well for the country, they needed to take care of justice by executing the man who had committed that murder. They would designate an avenger of blood. The avenger of blood would be this designated person from the family of the one who had been murdered to mete out that justice. There's an interesting story in 2 Samuel 14. So, King David, oftentimes they had to kind of trick him into understanding what was wrong. Anybody remember a time they had to trick David into realizing that he had made a mistake? Somebody said that.
Having Uriah killed and Bathsheba.
Yes, so Nathan the prophet came and had to tell him a story and trick him into realizing that he was the one who had actually sinned. This is it. This is the story. So Joab, the second chapter, 2 Samuel chapter 14, Joab uses a woman from Tekoa to trick David into realizing that he was using bad judgment. Absalom was in exile for 3 years, and he needed to bring him back. So that's the story that is used there is about this avenger of blood, and that's where that story comes from. So in Numbers 35, whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. So adequate proof must be present in order for a person to be put to death, right? But if there is adequate proof, you can't buy your way out of that. A murderer's freedom can't be purchased. So whether you're someone of means or not, it's going to apply to you in the same way. In Ecclesiastes, the 8th chapter, verse 10 and 11, it talks about the duties of the society. Then I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. When the government doesn't do their part in bearing the sword and carrying out justice, they're delaying justice, this has a negative impact on the society. So that's in the Old Testament. Is murder wrong in the New Testament? It absolutely is. You look at Romans, the 13th chapter. I think Kevin was referencing this scripture earlier. Romans, the 13th chapter, verses 8 through 10. Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, or any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. If you go back a few verses before that, Romans 3, verses 1 through 4, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So the idea here is that civil government is to prevent chaos, to punish those who do things that are wrong. And in the New Testament, the civil government has the responsibility to bear the sword. What's the sword for? Evildoers. What do you use a sword for? Kill, destroy, execute. The civil government has the responsibility to bear the sword when avenging those who have committed crimes that are worthy of execution. The avenger of blood, who is a family member in the Old Testament, who's the avenger of blood under the New Law, under the New Testament? It's the civil authority. That's what he's saying here in Romans, the 13th chapter. So now under the New Testament, murder hasn't changed. In fact, it's summed up in this idea of loving another. And the reason murder is wrong goes back to early in the teaching is the reality is from Genesis 9, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For he's in the image, for in the image of God he made man. Humans are made in the image of God, and we don't have the right to murder another human. So the idea here, again, is a really good concept that we can take from Paul's life and the way Paul is dealing with the civil authorities, the way he's dealing with the religious authorities, and the benefit he takes from using the law as described, but also the fact that he is submitting himself to the law, and if the law had required his death, he would have accepted that. Thankfully, it was not at that time. So, yes, sir?
Do we have any idea of why or what reason was given when Paul was executed?
No. So when we get to the end of chapter 28, it's almost like you finish that and you go, okay. So it's one of those cliffhangers where they don't write the end of the TV shows that go first season and they leave you the cliffhanger and they don't come back and do the next series. It's like, okay. He is ultimately executed a few years later, but we get that information from secular writers. So, and we don't really know why he was then put in prison a second time, but ultimately goes back to Rome and is executed several years later, not by the Jewish authorities, but by Nero. Good question. Any other thoughts or questions on that? The reality is he was sent to the first time to Rome without a charge against him, and that's what this chapter is actually dealing with. So let's go back over to chapter 25, and we'll get to the second question here. To whom did Paul appeal? So who did Paul appeal to? What did he say? I love this quote, right? I appeal to Caesar. Paul appealed to Caesar, which was the privilege given Roman citizens for situations like this one, where a Roman citizen felt that they were not being given a fair trial. He had no official charges that were proven against him, but what was the danger here? Remember, Paul's in a very similar situation to what Jesus was in. Despite the fact that Jesus was exonerated 3 times by the Roman authorities, what happened? He was ultimately killed, right? So Paul, despite the fact that he's been exonerated a number of times here, is still in danger of being turned over to the Jews and being killed. Paul knew of the Jews' previous plot to kill him back in Acts the 23rd chapter. So, Paul had to have suspected that if he went back to Jerusalem, what was that exposing him to? Exposing him to the Jews and the fact that the very real possibility that he was going to be a target for execution, which he already was when they were going to try and ambush him if he went back to Jerusalem. So he knew that his ultimate goal was to go where? Rome. Right? Going back to Jerusalem is the wrong direction. Only bad things are going to happen to him in Jerusalem. And that wasn't part of his plan or the Lord's plan for Paul. So Roman citizens had this, is really an ancient right to appeal to Caesar. In Latin, it was called the provocatio ad Caesarem, and it was an appeal to the emperor for a fair trial. It wasn't an appeal after a verdict had been turned in. So what's the difference here? Right? We appeal, say we go to trial and we have a judgment against us, what do? We appeal the verdict. We appeal the ruling. What Paul was appealing for, he just wanted to get a fair trial. He just wanted to get a fair shake. That's what his appeal was. As a Roman citizen, he had that right. And despite this right, was that immediately said, and Festus said, yeah, go. Actually, if you read in there, there's a little sentence that says, Festus, his response wasn't immediate. What did he do? He first conferred. He said, I got to talk about this for a second. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do here. I'm kind of in a pickle, right? I got this guy. I don't have any charges against him. The Jews want to take him. They want to kill him. I don't know what to do with the guy. So he says, meets with his council, and so he answers them finally, you've appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go. But Festus really had several options you think about in the situation, but he chose the one that was most politically expedient. He had been in power less than 2 weeks, if you think about that. Less than 2 weeks, and he has this really troubling situation. But Festus could have released Paul. He could have released him after finding him innocent. He could have denied Paul's appeal. But if he had denied Paul's appeal that was guaranteed to a Roman citizen, who's going to be in trouble then? Festus is going to be in trouble, right? So he couldn't do that. He could accept finally he could accept his appeal to Caesar and kind of rid himself of this problem that the Jews had put him into. And you know, the idea is that Festus still wanted to do the Jews a favor. He still wanted to curry favor with the Jews, with these new people that he was ruling. So Festus really makes a decision. He makes a decision of justice based upon the political expediency, this political influence. And we oftentimes will refer to making a decision as being political or all about politics to mean that it boils down to a power struggle between people or groups of people, and this idea that politics is the process of really of maneuvering to assert your own interest to gain or to retain power. So Festus wanted to cement his power and influence by pacifying the Jews who were in his province. Now, he talks about appealing to Caesar. If you bump down to verse 25, you may read, just for a moment, look at that. I found that he's talking to Agrippa here. We haven't got this far. But he talks about he had done nothing deserving of death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. Anybody else have a word instead of emperor? Augustus, that's right. Who was the emperor right now? Was it Augustus? It was, Becky? It was Nero. Why did he say Augustus? Wasn't Augustus the emperor during the time of Christ? Yes, he was. The reigning emperor at this time, as Becky mentioned, was Nero. He ruled from AD 54 to AD 68. But the word Augustus, was actually a title. It wasn't just a name. It was a title that was used by more than one emperor. And literally the word Augustus means, we use it, an august personage. But the idea is that it means majestic or great. And that title actually predated the Roman emperors and was used in the past, in ancient times, as an honorific, oftentimes with some type of religious connotation. So you think about the one who it was bestowed upon first was the son of Julius Caesar. So the son of Julius Caesar was Octavian, and he was referred to as Augustus Caesar. That was the first Caesar. And then after that, they would incorporate the name Augustus as more of a title or included in their name. It's called the regnal name. Who's the king in England right now? Charles, right? Is that his real name? I mean, is that his full name? He's King Charles William Ted Rupert, whatever, right? I'm sorry, King Charles. I apologize. But he has this regnal name. He has this full regnal name that he uses as the reigning monarch of Great Britain. Well, Nero's full regnal name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. That was a mouthful, right? So when he's referred to here as Augustus, it's more of the title or the august emperor that he's referring to. He's referring to Nero, not the Augustus Caesar that has died way back when during Jesus' time. Does it seem strange to you? I've always wondered, does it seem strange to you that Paul would put his life in the hands of this emperor, this specific emperor? Why would that ring kind of odd with you? What do we know about Nero? Was he generally kind of kindly disposed to Christians? Not a chance. Not a chance. But Paul was really adamant. Paul was adamant about having to get back into it. Yes, I agree with you. It was a terrible situation. He was adamant about not getting back into the Jews, the grasp of the Jews. He did not want to go to Jerusalem. He was adamant. So he couldn't count on being acquitted by the Roman governor, right? That's not going to happen, clearly. Felix and Festus both weren't going to acquit him. He didn't want to go back to the Jews in Jerusalem. And we know the Lord's promise to Paul from Acts 23 that you're going to testify for me also in Rome. Well, early in Nero's rule, so as I said, he ruled from 54 to 68, but early in Nero's rule, he was actually a pretty decent emperor, and he was under the influence, kind of like we've seen in kings of Judah. When they had good influence, they tended to be pretty good kings. Well, the Emperor Nero, early in his rule, was also under the influence of a couple of reasonable people. One was a Stoic philosopher named Seneca. There were some others who were good influences on him. Generally, the first years of Nero's rule were considered actually golden years. They were really good years for the Empire of Rome. They were good years for Roman citizens. And it wasn't until AD 62 that imperial policy started to go awry towards Christians, become really malicious. By the way, that happened after he divorced his wife and married another woman named Poppy, who influenced him in a very negative way towards the Christians. She was a Jewess. So it wasn't until AD 62 that the imperial policy really turns against the Christians, becomes malicious. The Great Fire of Rome, when does that occur? Anybody remember? AD 64. So AD 64, but none of that had happened at this time. None of that had happened, and Nero at this time is really considered a pretty good emperor. So when Paul's thinking about his choices, okay, go back to the Jews in Jerusalem? Nope. The governor's not going to release me after being exonerated multiple times. My best hope to get to Rome is I'm going to appeal to Caesar. All right, so let's get back to chapter 25. Let's look at verses 13 through 22. And here's where things really kind of get interesting. Festus has not been in power for very long. He really doesn't know these people that he's dealing with. He hasn't had a lot of experience with the Jews, but someone has. Who is that? Let's read in verse 13. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him." What did they want to do? Kill him. Verse 16, "I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charges laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal, or the judgment seat, and ordered the man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I had supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who is dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear that man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. So, everybody remembers this chart, one that's hard to read. It starts way back here with Herod the Great. Remember that, right? So the Herodian dynasty, Herod the Great, who's actually from the kingdom of where? Is he a Jew? He's not a Jew. He is from Edom. That's right. He's an Edomite. So Herod the Great, he has a lot of offspring, and who we're dealing with right now is Herod Agrippa II. We also are going to come in contact here with Bernice. And what's interesting is Bernice was married to her uncle, Herod of Chalcis. So you see how this lineage goes. Great-grandson of Herod the Great, great-granddaughter of Herod the Great, and a grandson of Herod the Great, Herod of Chalcis. Now, Herod of Chalcis is older than Bernice. Herod of Chalcis dies, and so Bernice, instead of getting married again, goes to live with Herod Agrippa II. Now, Stephen's going to discuss more about King Agrippa and Bernice next week, but to briefly set the stage, this Herod Agrippa II has there's these three siblings that we read about by chance. Remember Drusilla? Who is Drusilla married to? Last week, Felix. Drusilla was married to Felix, so close contact here. So we met Drusilla last week. Bernice was, as I said, was married to her uncle Herod of Chalcis. And then she lives with her brother, Herod Agrippa II, really in a scandalous and incestuous, reportedly incestuous relationships, really written about poorly by multiple writers, Tacitus, Seneca, Josephus. Not a good situation at all. She later goes on, well, like I said, Stephen's going to tell you more about that next week. So while Edomites by birth, the whole Herod family actually professes to be Jews in religion. So despite the fact that they're Edomites, they are now have been, the Herodian dynasty has been ruling in Judea in a variety of ways for years and years and years and years, and they like to think of themselves as Jews in terms of religion. So, question number 3, in verse 19, what does Festus say the accusations of the Jews were against Paul? Let's back up just for a second. Why do you think even that Festus was receptive to the request that King Agrippa hear Paul's? He kind of like, you bet. Like as soon as King Agrippa said that, you can just see Festus going, yes, I love that idea. Festus is new to the area. He's new to his position. He's not familiar. Who was familiar with the way? Do you remember that from last week? Who was more familiar with the way? Felix was very familiar with Christianity, more so than you would have expected. So Festus is not familiar with Christianity, with the way. He's not familiar with the Jews. He's not familiar with the story of Jesus, not like Felix and King Agrippa would have been. And so Festus had really inherited this problem from Felix. So I think he may have been, clearly he was looking for help. Yes, David?
I don't think you want to bug Nero. And that's what he's trying to avoid.
It is, and the reason is he's going to have egg on his face. He's going to send a man that's appealed to Nero, and what's he going to send with him as far as the charges? Nothing. How's he going to look? Yeah, he's in a quandary. He's in a real pickle here. He had inherited this, and he's trying to help resolve the issue and minimize political fallout. He's new to the job. It's not a good situation. So not only did Agrippa have a much greater knowledge of Jewish religion, he professed to actually live as a Jew. He was also, Agrippa was much more familiar with the political landscape. He'd been in the area for his whole life, well, except he had actually been in Rome for quite some time, but he was familiar with the political landscape and the different players that were there in Judea. So Festus specifically wants to get Agrippa's help, as David mentioned, to be able to write the report. He's got to write a report. He's got to send a letter with the guy. Hey, here's what, yes, Miles?
Well, even if you're thinking about the charges that would be against him, I think verse 20 is so interesting. Being at a loss as to verse 19, Jesus who was dead but whom Paul asserted to be alive, being at a loss how to investigate these. Like, if I was a judge and somebody came in and like one side said this man was crucified and we all saw it, and then this side said, no, actually he's alive, he raised from the dead, I would have no idea how to begin to investigate that.
Yeah.
So if you're going to pass him on to a higher authority, you would want to, it's already a confusing situation given that information, and if you don't really believe any of it or have any background knowledge on any of it, so you would want to have done your homework.
Jesus was a polarizing figure. Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Festus, he was not familiar with those stories. But not even realizing it, Festus is referring to what about Jesus? He's referring to the basis of our Christianity. He's referring to the resurrection. He's referring to the resurrection of Jesus, and he doesn't even realize it. Paul was teaching that Jesus was alive as Jesus was resurrected. Is that claim true? Was Paul teaching that? Yes, he was teaching that. Was that a crime? It was not a crime. Paul was teaching that Jesus was alive as Jesus was resurrected. That is true. He absolutely was doing that. But it was not a crime for Paul to teach the truth about Jesus' resurrection. But it was something that the Jews wanted to stop. Absolutely wanted Paul's mouth stopped. And really, you think about it, the similarities between how Paul was treated and how Jesus was treated really continue to strike a chord with me. Jesus was the king of the Jews, and he was killed for it. Because the Jews didn't want to accept the truth about Jesus as the Son of God, they're trying to kill Paul for it. They want Paul dead for teaching the truth. And in a way, Porcius Festus was to Paul kind of like Pontius Pilate was to Jesus. What did he value the most? Peace with the Jews. He valued the political situation. He valued peace with the Jews more than he valued justice. So despite determining that a prisoner was innocent, Jesus, Paul, he sent him to judgment, and Jesus was killed. Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 10 and verse 18, he says, "You will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." Jesus told them this was going to happen. So this meeting with Herod Agrippa II, it really has a parallel, I believe, in Jesus' inquest before Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas here, that's who Jesus went before. So both Jesus and Paul were tried before a Roman governor. Both Jesus and Paul witnessed to a Jewish king who was really anxious to meet him. And Agrippa here plays the role taken by Herod Antipas in Jesus' trial. So Luke begins to narrate what would be Paul's longest and final major speech. This is it for Paul. This is what this next defense, this next speech that we get is the last speech that's recorded of Paul's. But before doing this, Luke explains how it all unfolds. And there's quite some ceremony around that. When Agrippa and Bernice came together with Festus, was it a little quiet meeting in secret? No. It wasn't a private meeting. There was great fanfare. There were military tribunals like Lysias, powerful men like Lysias, who we've already come in contact with, prominent men who were powerful in the city and likely were advisors. Festus had turned this meeting, Agrippa and Bernice had come to see him. Festus had turned this meeting into a way to honor Agrippa and Bernice, to display their power. But everyone of influence was going to hear what was going to be spoken before Agrippa. Agrippa wanted to hear it. They're going to get Paul together, and everybody was going to be there that was of importance. The speech that we're going to hear in chapter 26 was really tightly constructed, carefully thought out. Luke considers this speech as really being a very important part of his message, and it was really Paul's crowning witness before the Jewish authorities and the important Gentile dignitaries of the land. So this isn't an official trial. It's not really even an inquiry. Paul had appealed to Caesar, and this wish had already been granted by Festus, and so this is really more of an informal hearing, really because King Agrippa is curious, and so that he could help Festus construct this report to the emperor to help him out. It was also a spectacle, a lot of spectacle, kind of great theater. Agrippa and Bernice come into all of this pomp and circumstance and all the lesser dignitaries behind them. But who is the star of the show? Paul's the star of the show. At the center of this controversy that wouldn't quit, we have this big media event, if you will. Like the Athenians, everybody seemed to want to know about the new ideas that he was proclaiming. So we have 1 minute left. What we have here, it's kind of difficult to know what Agrippa could add to what Festus already knew. He had just admitted there was no chargeable offense. The ostensible reason that Festus was still holding Paul was that he was doing Felix a favor, doing Jews a favor, and that he was a prisoner that had appealed to Rome. But the Roman governor essentially admitted there was no definite charge to write Rome about. And so this admission that Paul ought to have been freed, really should have been freed in Caesarea, why send the guy? Why send him if there's no charge? So it may have been that Festus was hoping that Agrippa, with more expert knowledge of the Jews or the law, might be able to find something to which Paul could be charged, or if not, at least Festus could use his name, like, hey, I had him meet with Agrippa. He didn't find anything either. It's really clever political maneuver by Festus, if you think about it. So Luke has dramatically set the stage for Paul, and when we return next week, Stephen's going to bring us Paul's final defense. Thank you for your time.